The 127-year-old sugar company, Tongaat Hulett, suspended its trading on the JSE and London Stock Exchange earlier this week. The company requested the suspension of its listing after it misstated its revenues from land sales by between 3.5 and 4.5 billion rand. The share price plummeted by 85% from its highest of 89 rands per share last August. Deloitte was the auditor for Tongaat and has been for more than 15 years. The firm launched an internal investigation and replaced all senior auditors on the account. It is the second time in as many years that Deloitte is caught up in a scandal of this magnitude after they were caught in charge of Steinhoff's auditing, or they were involved in Steinhoff's auditing. And joining me to unpack all the details is the publisher and editor of Biz News, Alec Hogg, who's here in the studio with me. And on the line, we have Rob Rose of the Financial Mail. And good evening to you, Rob. Welcome.
Thanks.
Pleasure to have you. And let me start with you, Alec. How did this happen? I'm just imagining, how do you misstate revenues by 3.5 to 4.5 billion rands?
Over many years, and it's probably more than that.
Yeah.
That was the number they gave us on the 31st of May. The 10th of June this week, they said, could be even worse. Tim, it's been going on for many years. You tend to get into a vicious circle when you begin by overvaluing assets. And it's like a treadmill. And these assets, it's not just the property sales, it's also sugarcane. Now, if you think about KZN, where they are, where Tongaat Hulett are, they have to keep replenishing the sugarcane fields. So they grow little, if you like, little plants of cane, and there's a value that is attached to that. If you start overvaluing that, that can get out of control quite quickly. And to give you an example, a year ago, or 18 months ago, the sugar price internationally was double what it is today. So when your assets are being overvalued, and you haven't actually every year brought them down, you very quickly get out of control. And that's what's happened here. They're in a parlous situation. They've got a lot of debt. The banks have been forced to basically take over the company. They've had to cede their debtors. They've had to take any sales that Tongaat does now goes straight to the banks. It's not a good situation to be in.
But how did we get to this point in the case of Tongaat? I mean, I hear the detail of what happened, but, you know, if you have auditors, you've got people with experience, you've got asset managers who invest in these companies, were they not able to pick up that something was not right within the Tongaat Hulett stable?
There are some similarities with Steinhoff as well, in that the bankers have been forwarding money. Now, the bankers will give you money on security, and the security is based on what your assets are worth. If your assets are being inflated, then the bankers will give you more debt than you should be having.
Based on the inflated.
And that's really what's
valuation.
happened. It's escalated, and now they've got to a situation where they brought in a new chief executive in the beginning of this year, and he's clearly, it's not just him. A year ago, there was an asset manager from Investec who said that there was big trouble. No one listened to him. But if you'd sold the shares then, you would have sold them at 80 rand. They were suspended at 13, and you won't be able to trade in them for another 5 months. So this is a situation where, a bit like Steinhoff, the banks now own the company, and if the banks are prepared to stick with them, then Tongaat and the 30,000 employees will come through it. If the banks don't, it'll be a very sticky ending.
Now, Rob, why is Pricewaterhouse brought in? I mean, their auditors are Deloitte. What are they looking for? I mean, what is Pricewaterhouse asked to investigate?
Well, Tim, it's pretty much the same thing as what happened at Steinhoff, in that Deloitte was the auditors there, and they audited the accounts, and they found things that they thought were certainly suspicious, so they asked for an external forensic auditor to come in. And in the case of Steinhoff, it was PwC as well. In this case, also PwC. I mean, you need to have a separate forensic investigator having a look at your accounts, partly because you don't know what Deloitte's done wrong. You don't want Deloitte to be then conducting its own investigation into what it missed, because it could potentially cover up its own role in this.
So I suppose it's still early to apportion blame here and say these are the individuals that were responsible for whatever happened within the company. But to go back to what you said, Alec, in terms of the shareholders, the listing being suspended, what does it mean? That the shareholders who've invested in the Tongaat Hulett share have their money locked in the company. They cannot access it, cannot withdraw, cannot trade in it.
And it's a fractional amount. 2 years ago, this share price was at 168 Rand.
Yeah.
It was suspended at 13 Rand. So it's what we call a negative 10 bagger. In other words, it's fallen more than 90%. They cannot trade the shares. The shares are now suspended on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange until the financial results to the end of March come out in October. They're hoping for it. So once the financial results come out, at that point in time, a bit like Steinhoff, you can expect a very different share price. It might go up. It could well go up, and we've seen some of the value managers going in and nibbling around at the shares. PSG bought 10% of the company just a couple of weeks ago. So there's a possibility that all is not lost, but it really depends now on the banks. Are the banks going to stay with them? Are they going to allow this to lift up? And 30,000 people have got jobs. Tim, you must though, just in Deloitte's defense.
Yeah.
It's been a storm from every side. You have the asset values have really been smashed in the past year through, first of all, in Zimbabwe. They've got over $200 million in Zimbabwe, more than 2 billion Rand. They can't get that money out. That's sitting on the balance sheet, which as investors have been thinking, well, there's cash there. It isn't cash. So you actually, as Deloitte, you take a value judgment on is that money locked up or not. Also with the collapse in the sugar price, also with the collapse in property prices in KZN, there are a lot of things that have gone wrong for the company.
They could not have anticipated. They went with what was available to them at that time. But I think, Rob, if you can comment on this, the other question is that of the role that is played by the stock exchanges to monitor these companies, because ordinary folk who invest in these companies' shares expect some protection, I suppose, and they place their trust in the rigor of the stock exchanges to make sure that what is reported is legit, is what they're told to be, told it is. Yeah.
Tim, I think they do to some extent, but there's a whole lot of people right the way along the line who should have noticed things, and the auditors, I suppose, are the first line of defense. I mean, firstly, you have management; you don't expect them to lie to you, and you have a board that is supposed to make sure that management isn't lying. Then you have external auditors who are supposed to assure you that the numbers are what they say they are, and that clearly wasn't the case with Tongaat. The JSE also has a role. They should make sure that the legitimacy of the information is what it's supposed to be, and that often hasn't been the case recently. But it's, as Alec mentioned, there's a whole lot of things that conspired in this case, and it was a storm that completely blew up on Tongaat and exposed just how the poor governance at the company, which clearly had been going on for a number of years.
But then you have investigated Steinhoff. Tell me, what is the difference or what are the similarities or differences between what is going on here and what happened in Steinhoff?
Well, they both had Deloitte as auditors, for one thing. To some extent, Steinhoff appears to have been intentional. At this moment, we don't quite know if Tongaat was intentional, if it was an actual fraud, or it was just accounting problems and people had overstated things. We don't know the degree of culpability. Whereas now, thanks to what's come out of PwC's report of Steinhoff, we know that there was an intentional inflation of revenue. There was fictitious transactions with Steinhoff of 106 billion Rand, which is an immense amount. So I think at this point, it's very difficult for us to say quite how intentional anything was at Tongaat, and whether you can ascribe that then to fraud or to errors of judgment and overvaluations that might not have been wrongful in their actual intention.
Well, when a case of this nature comes up within 12 months of Steinhoff, the public in South Africa turn around and say, given the spread of corruption in our society, they say, the corporate sector is as corrupt as what is going on in the public sector, and thus they lose confidence and say, but this could be the tip of the iceberg, that what we're seeing here from Tongaat Hulett and Steinhoff, that much more of this nature is happening within the private sector. Would that be the case, you think?
Well, you can't blame people for feeling that way. Steinhoff, though, was a spectacular fraud on a global scale, where fictitious invoices were created. And we know from the numbers that PwC have told us, it runs into billions and billions of euros. So we've got to park that. That's a one-off. As far as Tongaat is concerned, where the big question comes in here is when you have assets that you're investing in, like those little cane plants, you can capitalize it. In other words, you take the expenses off your profit line, inflate your profits by taking the expenses and putting it into capital. Now, is that legal or illegal? And I think that's going to be the question. Was it aggressive accounting? If so, Deloitte's in trouble. Was it fraud that was committed within the company, which looks less likely, but if that's the case, then people in the company are in trouble. But there's a lot to be said for simplifying things, for actually for companies now to start telling things a lot more simply and basically, so that we as shareholders and the public can understand and stop giving the benefit of the doubt to corporate executives just because they're the corporate executives. This has been well investigated, this company. As I said, a year ago, there was an investment analyst who said he was waving the flags. There was another shareholder who actually went to the board about 9 months ago and explained to them what the problem was. And the board kind of fobbed him off. So it's time to start taking the critics a lot more seriously, the minority reports. We've got to start listening to them. We have this inclination to be befuddled by the spin, and we can't do that anymore.
Well, Rob, what is your take?
I mean, Alec explained it perfectly. I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, we have a moment to look at what's happening in South Africa in the corporate sector and the private sector more widely, I suppose. And I do think we need to reflect on why these things are happening, because it's not just Steinhoff and Tongaat. There's been EOH. There's been issues with Tiger Brands, listeriosis. There's been a lot of things happening. And I think Alec mentioned it. A degree of skepticism from the board and the auditors. We have completely trusted CEOs over the last 10 years, and we haven't exactly been rewarded for that. So I think that greater skepticism is one thing. And then what the JSE has talked about is strengthening the guardians of governance. And in that category, they talk of the media, which is quite a frail industry at the moment. You talk of the analysts, you talk of the auditors, and everyone around the entire ecosystem. We should be keeping an eye on these kind of things.
And what does this say, though? Rob Walsh is still there. What does it say about the auditing profession, for instance? Because I suppose many people depend on their word to trust whatever shares they invest their monies in.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a problem. You have issues with KPMG that have gone on for a couple of years in this country and overseas as well. In India, there were these requests to ban Deloitte and KPMG a couple of weeks ago. So the auditing profession, I think, globally is in crisis. But to some extent, I also feel a bit sorry for some of the auditors occasionally, because, if somebody like Marcus Jooste is busy tying up this massive fraud through very clever ways in which he actually inflated the cash flows, and cash is what's supposed to be in the bank. You shouldn't be able to inflate that. So you have these ingenious frauds happening, and you have auditors who operate in a very formulaic way, and these guys are their clients, and they've been completely befuddled. So I think there's a moment for them to reflect on themselves and also to show much greater skepticism in their jobs.
And Alec?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that Rob made, and that was where the difference is between Steinhoff and Tongaat Hulett. With Steinhoff, the cash flow, you couldn't tell it. If you looked at the cash flow statement, which is usually a giveaway, you couldn't tell because they were fiddling the books. With Tongaat, if you looked at the cash flow statement and you looked at the profits, you could see that the two didn't match. You could see there was something that wasn't quite right, and that's how the investment analysts picked it up. Minority Report, again, we've got to listen to these guys and ask tougher questions and get away from this more cozy relationship that even we as the media have with corporate executives. We need to put them on the spot more.
Alec Hawke, thank you very much, publisher of Biz News, much appreciated. And Rob Rose of the Financial Mail, thanks again for joining us via the telephone line. Still ahead, today marks the final day of President Cyril Ramaphosa's first post-election cabinet lekgotla, and we'll be discussing what's likely to come out of this crucial meeting. In other words, what statement should we expect from him when he addresses the nation on the 20th of June?